In this final video, we're going to talk about how the equilibrium price and quantity can change. Remember, in Chapter 3, we talked about determinants of demand and determinants of supply, or as your textbook calls them, demand shifters and supply shifters. Okay? If one or both of these curves shift, either to the right or to the left, up or down, that is going to change where the intersection of supply and demand is located, and that means it's going to change the equilibrium price and or the equilibrium quantity. So first I'm going to talk about what happens to equilibrium price and quantity when the demand curve shifts. Then we'll talk about what happens to it when the supply curve shifts, and then we'll consider simultaneous shifts in supply and demand. All right, so beginning with demand shifts. Let's say that this is a market, let's stick with orange juice like we talked about in earlier videos. Suppose that in this market for orange juice, something happens that increases demand. All right, so maybe a new product comes out, or not a new product, a new study comes out telling people that orange juice is good for their teeth, right? Maybe it whitens your teeth or it strengthens the enamel. Neither of which thing could possibly be true as far as I'm aware, but let's just say that such a study comes out, all right, and people believe it. Well, what's that going to do? It's probably going to increase people's demand for the product. If now you know that it's doing something extra for you that you didn't know about before, you're probably going to be willing to pay more for it, or at a given price, you'll want to buy more of it. Okay, so that would be represented by a rightward shift in the demand curve. So demand would shift out to this point, to this line. I'm going to call this new demand curve D prime. Okay. Now, you started at an original equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. So let me mark those before we go any farther. All right, there's the original equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. Now with the shift in demand, what has happened, or what's going to happen? Well, notice that if prices stayed the same, if prices didn't change, then suppliers would still be willing to sell the old equilibrium quantity. But at this older, lower price, consumers would want to buy a lot more. Quantity demanded would increase by quite a bit. Well, if quantity demanded is out here and quantity supplied is back at the old equilibrium, you've got a shortage, right? And a shortage is going to put upward pressure on the price. As the price increased, buyers would want to buy less of the product, sellers would want to sell more of the product, and eventually they would meet in the middle here at the new equilibrium. So we'll call that new price PE prime, new quantity QE prime. Okay. Now notice what has happened. As the demand curve shifted up and to the right, as demand increased, the equilibrium price increased and the equilibrium quantity increased. I'm going to write down a shorthand for that on the right. Okay. If demand increases, then the market price is going to increase and the market quantity is going to increase. All right, now let's suppose that something happens that makes demand decrease. Anytime a study comes out telling you that some food or drink is good for you, another study is going to come out a little while later telling you that no, actually it's bad for you. So suppose that a second study comes out and the second study doesn't say anything about the whitening effects on your teeth of orange juice, but maybe it says, oh, hey, drinking more orange juice is associated with higher risk of bladder cancer. All right. Well, now that there's this negative information out there about orange juice, that's probably going to decrease the demand for orange juice. So let's say that we're at this this new equilibrium. The news comes out about orange juice being bad for your health, and maybe that's going to shift the demand curve all the way back past the original demand curve. Maybe it's going to fall to here. Call that demand curve D double prime. All right. Well, suppose for a moment that prices didn't adjust. Well, then sellers would still be willing to sell this very high quantity QE prime, but the buyers wouldn't want to buy that many units. Now, this price is hitting the new demand curve at a very low quantity of units demanded. And so this would be a surplus of product. The surplus puts downward pressure on the price as sellers compete with each other to cut their prices and get rid of the surplus, sell off the excess product. And so as the price fell, quantity supplied would start to decrease. As the price fell, quantity demanded would start to increase as we move along this demand curve. And eventually, they're going to meet in the middle. And you've got PE double prime, QE double prime. All right. Now notice that when demand shifted down into the left, the price fell and the quantity fell as well. And so I'll write a shorthand for that over here. If demand decreases, market price will decrease, market quantity will also decrease. All right, so that is demand. Now, what would happen if the supply curve shifted? I'm going to go back to our original supply and demand curves, and let's mark the equilibrium price and quantity. Now let's say that something happens to increase the supply of orange juice. Maybe a new fertilizer comes out, a new cheap fertilizer that allows orange trees to grow more fruit on them that that are larger and still maintain the flavor of their juice. Okay, this is, like I said, it's a cheap fertilizer, and so it makes it so that for any given price, sellers would be willing to sell more units of orange juice, or for any given quantity, they could sell it to you for at a lower price. Okay, what would that mean? That would be a shift in the supply curve down and to the right, because the prices at which the sellers are willing to sell is going to start falling. So let's put a parallel supply curve out here. It shifts to the right, like so. We'll call that supply curve S prime. Okay, suppose prices did not change from the old equilibrium. Well, buyers would still want to buy the same quantity of units that they were at the old equilibrium because their demand hasn't changed, and neither has the price. But at that price, sellers are now willing to sell a lot more units. That is a surplus. That surplus is going to start pushing the price down. And as the price falls, quantity demanded is going to increase, quantity supplied is going to decrease until they hit the new equilibrium. All right, so notice what's happened. An increase in supply has increased the quantity, but it has decreased the price at which sellers are going to sell. Okay, so it doesn't have quite the same relationship as an increase in demand does with price and quantity. So in shorthand, we could write that if supply increases, the market price will go down, the market quantity will go up. Okay? Now, let's do something that reduces demand. Suppose that Florida is where a lot of oranges are grown for orange juice. California too, although not as much as it used to be. Let's suppose that Florida has a really bad winter, so that there's a lot of frost that comes and kills off some of the trees, or at least some of the buds on the tree early in the growing season, and that reduces the total amount of oranges that are available for producing juice. Well, that is going to increase the cost of one of their inputs because it's become more scarce. And so the supply curve is going to shift back, and let's suppose that the supply curve goes past the original supply curve, like so. We'll call this one S double prime. Okay? Now, supposing that prices didn't change, notice that consumers would still want to buy just as many units as they were buying before. But sellers on this new supply curve, at that old equilibrium price, they're not going to be willing to sell very many units at all. Okay, quantity supplied is going to be very low. That creates a shortage. In a shortage, competition among the buyers is going to start pushing this price up. And as that price goes up, quantity demanded is going to fall, quantity supplied is going to increase, and they will meet somewhere in the middle at the new equilibrium price and quantity. Call the price PE double prime, the quantity QE double prime. And now looking at those 2 points, you can see, if the supply curve shifts up and to the left, if supply decreases, what's going to happen? Well, the price is going to go up. It's going to get more expensive to buy. And the quantity of units demanded, or the quantity of units sold in equilibrium, is going to go down. So if supply falls, price rises, and the quantity decreases. Okay. So now we've looked at demand shifts individually and supply shifts individually. Let's think about what happens when there's a simultaneous shift in supply and demand. So we've got these 4 things that can happen: demand increasing or decreasing, supply increasing or decreasing. If you've got a simultaneous shift in supply and demand, it means one of these 2 things is happening and one of those 2 things is happening. Okay? And it turns out that if there's a simultaneous shift in supply and demand, you'll either know what's going to happen to prices or quantities, but you won't know what's going to happen to both of them. Okay? Let me start with the logic of just kind of pairing up these shorthand rules with each other, and going through the logic of it, and then I will graph an example. So let's suppose that demand increases, and at the same time, let's suppose that supply decreases. There's a drop in supply. What is that going to do? Well, there's going to be an impact on the price. There's also going to be an impact on the quantity. An increase in the demand is going to push up the price of the product. So I'll put 1 arrow to the right of the price. What about a decrease in supply? Well, if you look at the shorthand, you'll see that a decrease in supply will also result in an increase in price. Okay? So both of these 2 shifts are going to have the effect of pushing prices up. So we know prices are going to increase. Okay, what about quantity? Well, an increase in demand increases the quantity of units in equilibrium. But a decrease in demand decreases the quantity of units. So these 2 shifts are moving in opposite directions with regards to the quantity in equilibrium. So there, we don't know what's going to happen. Okay? Now, take any 2 pairs of a shift in demand and a shift in supply, and for either price or quantity, the arrows are going to be going in the same direction. But for the other, either price or quantity, the arrows are going to go in opposite directions. And the answer of what happens in this case to the equilibrium quantity depends on just how far each of these curves shifts. So let's graph out this example. Demand increases. We can show that with a parallel shift in the demand curve. Call it D prime. Oh, and as before, let me put in the original equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, we've shifted the demand curve to the right, and notice that that has pushed the price up, and it has also pushed the quantity out. So there's been an increase in both if we're just looking at that shift in demand. But now we're also going to have a shift in the supply curve. Specifically, supply is going to decrease. There's going to be less supply available. So supply is going to shift to the left, up and to the left, you could say. And let's shift it like so. There's our new supply curve, S prime. Okay, and so the demand curve was shifting prices up. The supply shift is going to increase prices even more, all right? So that the price is going to be higher in the new equilibrium than it was in the old. Put that right there. Call that PE prime. Okay, so just as we wrote down here, the price is definitely going up, and that's happened from those two shifts. What about quantity? Well, the increase in demand increased the equilibrium quantity, but then the decrease in supply started decreasing the equilibrium quantity. But since the demand curve shifted farther than the supply curve did, the net effect in this case is still an increase in quantity. Okay? But it didn't have to end up there. Okay, for example, if the supply curve had shifted, let's say, right through here, if this is how far the supply curve had shifted, then notice that the quantity in the new equilibrium would be exactly the same as it was in the old equilibrium. In other words, the quantity effect of the supply and demand shifts would have exactly canceled each other out. Or if supply had shifted to the left even farther, if it had gone back, say, this far, call it S triple prime. Now, if this were the equilibrium, the new equilibrium quantity would be less than it was in the original equilibrium. Okay? So depending on how far we shift this curve, we could affect that quantity to be greater than, less than, or equal to the old equilibrium. But no matter what we do, the equilibrium price is higher than it was before because both the demand shift and the supply shifts are pushing those prices up. Okay? I will leave it as an exercise to you to think about or to graph out what would happen if demand was decreasing at the same time supply was decreasing, and the other iterations of this as well. All right? So that is it for this video series, and I will talk to you guys next week.